Father Paul, welcome back to my channel. It's a great pleasure. As you know, I have received your latest book only a couple of days ago in my mail, which is this one, Spiritual Direction from Dante, specific for Yearning for Paradise. So, which is your latest publication that, let's say, crowns the trilogy, because you have already published two, one for Inferno and one for Purgatorio that we talked about the last time. For the viewers who don't know you, who haven't seen the previous interview, would you mind introducing yourself briefly?
Yes, sir. My name is Father Paul Pearson. I'm an Oratorian priest of the Oratory of San Filippo Neri, and whose anniversary of canonization we just celebrated on the 12th of March. He was canonized 400 years ago, along with St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Francis Xavier, Teresa of Avila, and Isidore the Farmer. It was called the Day of the Five Saints, and really one of the biggest days in the church's history of canonizations. They'd never canonized multiple people before. So we had a big celebration on Saturday for that 400th anniversary. Yeah, exactly. It was a sort of feast day for the Counter-Reformation. So I have been here at the Oratory since 1985. And as a member of the Oratory, and I've been teaching in St. Philip's Seminary, which is run by my community. We train only people for the priesthood, and we now have about 240 of our students who are priests around the world.
That's wonderful, really wonderful. And you had this idea a few years ago, I guess, because you were already in love with Dante and with the Divine Comedy, to put all of your experience in teaching Dante into a trilogy of books, right? Is that more or less how it happened?
Yeah, I started teaching these books in part because people had trouble reading scripture in a spiritual way. And so I wanted to say, well, how could I make this work? So I thought, well, Dante consciously writes like scripture on 4 different levels. So I said, Dante would be good practice, and I'd love reading Dante anyway. So we started reading the Inferno back in 1990. So it's been more than 30 years now. And they loved it. I just didn't tell them it was poetry because they would have been scared off by that. So we read it, they loved it, and we did Dante many times. And then we did the Inferno many times. Then we slowly got into Purgatorio. The course wasn't long enough for me to be able to teach Paradiso to the same students. So it took years for me and a little pressure from 10 books before I started teaching Paradiso. But now I've taught all 3 of them many times. And we found it such an enriching spiritual experience, not just a sort of aesthetic experience, but a personal experience. And I think that was something that had always, at least in my mind, been missed when I was reading Dante and poring over commentaries. I'm trained as a medievalist here at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, and Dante is what I wrote part of my master's thesis on. But I missed that personal, spiritual demand that he was making. And I think that, in my mind, that is one of the main things that Dante's trying to promote in his reader. He's saying, this is what happened to me. This was a personal experience for me, and I want you to take it as personal as it was for me. And so that's why this series is entitled Spiritual Direction from Dante, because I really think he's trying to do what, at the end of Paradiso, as I hope we'll talk about later, St. Peter asks him to do. He sort of sets him on a mission. And I thought that mission has been misunderstood by so many of his commentators, or at least that part has been overlooked.
Yeah, I'm very happy you are touching on this very fundamental point already, because to me, this is almost the elephant in the room when it comes to general discussions about Paradiso in today's universities, in today's circles, academia, but also outside of academia, which is Dante, the Divine Comedy, the whole poem from Inferno to Paradiso is a Christian poem, okay, but the other 2 cantiche, Inferno and Purgatorio, are not as intensely and specifically Christian and for Christians as Paradiso. And Dante addresses this point at the very beginning of Paradiso, doesn't he, when he talks about the bread of angels. One question I had for you, in fact, and I don't know if there is a precise answer to this, but when Dante talks about the bread of angels and the fact that, you know, he is in front of us, he's sailing with this beautiful shiny boat in the against the sun, and we are kind of trying to keep up with our little mingy boat in the behind him, wooden boat, the piccioletta barca. Did he mean with that only theology and only the study and understanding of theology, or is it possible that he actually meant something beyond only theology, but also the faith aspect of Christianity?
I think he meant something way more personal than that. I think he meant what happened there at the when our Lord was preaching, and he said, "I am the bread of life." And so I think that bread of angels that he's talking about is in fact Christ himself. That, and heaven is all about this, being in the presence of Christ, in the presence of God. And so it's not about a theory anymore. It's not about an abstraction about what's natural or what's sinful or not, what's virtuous. It's about connecting with a person. And so that's the way I've always taken that. And as a result, we can theologize about it, but that experience of being united to Christ is something that you can't reduce to a theological study.
Because in speaking about Paradiso to my atheist friends and people who are not Christian, I feel sometimes a little hesitant, and I even would say embarrassed in being fully, let's say, enthusiastic as I would like to be about Paradiso from the Christian point of view, because I want to respect everybody, but there is a, you know, there is a fear of excluding somebody out of the full beauty of Paradiso. Now, with time, I've come to believe that this is probably what Dante wanted, and we shouldn't be really afraid of this. You still can enjoy Paradiso very, very much as an atheist secular reader, but you will know, you will be aware that you're missing something if you don't have a personal relationship with Christ, right?
And I think, and partly, this Paradiso stands as a sort of invitation to something, an invitation to a banquet that you're invited to, but you haven't yet accepted the invitation, or you haven't yet come into the banquet hall. And so there is, for everybody this side of heaven, there is a sort of outside looking in aspect to Paradiso. So I think that that's something we have to put up with. And that's why I entitled this particular part of my commentary, Yearning for Paradise, because we're standing outside and still hoping for it. It's something that we don't yet touch, that we don't yet taste, that we can't quite experience. It's beyond everything.
Yeah.
But we could still have our hearts burn for it.
Yeah. So I really, really love the foreword of the book. And I love the fact that he's actually quoting this little booklet that I'm probably the only one in Los Angeles to have it, which is called Candor Lucis Aeternae. And it's the apostolic letter on the 7th centenary of the death of Dante Alighieri, of course, available in many different languages, and written by Pope Francis in celebration of Dante and in specific of the Divine Comedy. We talked the last time we were chatting, we talked about the respect that the Church has always had for the Divine Comedy, but almost it has a renewed respect that's been strengthened in the last century, maybe, with new studies, etc. And it's beautiful because in the foreword, the foreword is by Father de Souza, Raymond de Souza, who, was he one of your students?
He was.
Ah, okay. I didn't want to get that wrong, but that's really beautiful that he accepted to, write the foreword for your book. And he goes straight to the heart of it, and he quotes Candor Lucis Aeternae. Let me read a little passage. Candor Lucis Aeternae could be read as a thoroughgoing endorsement for spiritual direction from Dante, an endorsement of your book. The apostolic letter quotes more often from Paradiso than from Inferno and Purgatorio, for it's only there that the poet's mission as a prophet of hope becomes clear. And then he quotes from Pope Francis, who says, Dante today does not wish merely to be read, commented on, studied, and analyzed. Rather, he asks to be heard and even imitated. He invites us to become his companions on the journey. So transformation and change, which is, roughly speaking, what we were alluding to before, this kind of personal invitation, this to the banquet, and the necessarily deeply religious value of Paradiso, that maybe sometimes makes readers across the world a little bit more hesitant, a little bit more shy to approach it. Have you seen a little bit of this?
I have, and but I think that, as you were mentioning before, there's something which sort of prods the conscience about that. And I think what it does is it reminds you that you were made for more than this. Part of the reason you're finding this uncomfortable is that you know that the world you're living in isn't enough for you. You know it's a crazy world. It's not perfect, and it will never be perfect. You'll never be happy here. You'll never fit in. And so unless this is an enormous mistake and you're never going to be happy, then there has to be something better. And I think we all have that yearning for something better, and the sense that I was called to something higher than what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, yeah, that is beautifully said, and it kind of leads me directly to something you wrote in your own introduction here in the book, which is you quoted the definition of heaven from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which I thought was, it's so simple but so important, because we approach Paradiso of Dante very often, without having a clear picture in our mind, actually very often having a false picture of what heaven is for the great Catholic tradition. Would you like to?
Yes, I think that's really important, because I think part of what we have to do as a modern reader of Paradiso is to strip away that sort of misinformation, because we basically have this idea, and for me it's summed up by the Far Side cartoon that has the dumpy looking man with wings sitting on the edge of the cloud, looking bored, saying, I wish I brought a magazine. And we think of it as sort of second best. And if we could choose between staying alive and dying, we'd obviously choose staying alive. But if I have to die, then heaven is sort of the consolation prize. It's certainly better than hell. Nobody who understands heaven is going to think that. And so I think that we have to get rid of that misunderstanding. But and there are a bunch of other things, and this is the big part of the introduction, many other things that get in the way. Concerns about things like, I won't really be fulfilled. The man on the cloud wishing he'd brought a magazine. It's going to be sort of boring. My real desires, my deepest desires aren't going to be fulfilled. And that's exactly what the Catechism attacks. Also, that I'm sort of going to become a plaster saint. I'm going to become sort of generically holy. My personality is going to be lost in the wash.
Oh yeah, my individuality. Yes.
Yeah. And I think that those are both important things that the church emphasizes in the Catechism, but almost nobody really thinks much about.
Yes, yes. There is a sense, I would say, all across our modern pop culture, but I would call it probably throughout the whole last century. And I remember a couple of quotes from Mark Twain talking about this as well, that heaven is almost equivalent with boredom, and hell is almost equivalent with entertainment and party.
Yeah.
And okay, it's a joke, but I think many people resonate with this because of our modern world. The false equivalence between entertainment and very superficial laughter and with happiness, which is something that obviously Christianity has always been pushing against, but in this day and age, especially today, it seems like it's been very at least partially, okay, lost.
Mm-hmm.
And the sense of happiness, the sense that the definition of heaven is the utmost possible happiness that a human being can achieve, is lost. It's almost it's difficult outside of religious environments to grasp and to see the beauty of this concept, no?
Yes, it is. I think that we short sell paradise because of that, and we have trouble even thinking about it as something desirable. And I think that's something Dante is certainly trying to address, because I think it must have been true in his day too. People feared hell more than they yearned for heaven.
Mm, that's a
Yeah,
good point.
yeah.
Yeah, the reality of hell, the reality of the devil was much more sensible in his times than today, no?
To be fair, though, I think that there is something about Paradiso, even in Dante's compelling version of it, that is less dramatic than Inferno or Purgatorio. And there's a drama, there's a journey, there is a narrative that's happening. Once you get to Paradiso, you've sort of arrived. And there's no more, there aren't really surprises in the same way. The surprises are all very subtle and gentle, and there's a lot of talking, which is why the book is so thick. So it takes a lot more. It takes a lot more explaining for it to work. So I think it is probably the least accessible of the books for that reason too. So it's not just that heaven's less interesting, but it's also that it's so beyond what we're sort of accustomed to dealing with.
Yeah.
Our minds are so used to dealing with these everyday sense matters. We're not used to thinking in these abstract ways.
Yeah. Well, and of course, there is a lot of, let's say, imagery and that rotates around light. I read somewhere that the medieval people had a real identification between everything that had to do with light, with really happiness, peace, because of how their world was. If we try to imagine a world that basically had to stop in the moment when the sun went down, which is so foreign to us, you know, oh, it's 6:30, okay, meeting is over, everybody goes home because we can't see anything.
Yeah.
Of course, there was candlelight, but the power, that centrality of light is reflected in the Paradiso, right?
And think about the way a Gothic cathedral works, where they make the walls thinner and thinner and thinner so they can just fill the walls with glass. Because for them, living in the presence of God and worshiping God was living in a light-filled space. And so I think there is something there that even architects were beginning to see. And this was exploding during Dante's time. During the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, the Gothic architecture takes over, and really it's all about getting the building out of the way of the light.
I mean, that sentence in itself is making me miss my country and go back to Ravenna and visit those beautiful churches. So still on this point of the overall importance of Paradiso as part of the Divine Comedy, I thought that maybe one of the, let's say, literary figures who could help today make a little sense, or maybe highlight the importance of Paradiso, could be C.S. Lewis, because in particular, C.S. Lewis had been writing about, in his A Grief Observed, about his wife's death. She died, I believe, in 1960, and a few years later, he published this A Grief Observed, where he really touched on this profound concept of the transformation of love from that reminds me a lot about what Dante says about love, because from something that was present between two people and seems to and with death and with loss seems to destroy everything, seems to annul everything, then C.S. Lewis, came to the conclusion that that he was always in the presence of real love. And if I have understood his A Grief Observed well, and in my mind, I kind of link that type of experience, of course, with Dante and Beatrice, even though we don't know all the details of that experience, but certainly we know that there has been a great heartbreak at a certain point in Dante's life, probably when he was still very young. And from this heartbreak, could we say that without this heartbreak, his growth into the fully mature Christian could never have really have happened?
I think each person needs to come to a place where they recognize that the best that this world can offer me doesn't last and isn't enough. And therefore, I have to look for something else. I have to find my consolation elsewhere. And sometimes you have to be broken before you recognize that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and somebody said that without having lost your hope at least once in your life, you cannot really fully enjoy the Divine Comedy because it is all about refinding hope. It's all about finding hope again, and obviously finding love. But what you just said really touched something, because it reminds me of a sentence by Pope Benedict, where he said, you know, there is no human relationship, as beautiful, as fulfilling that it might be, that will fully satisfy us. And this is another one of these Christian concepts that is not very popular in today's world.
And when I'm starting with a marriage prep class, and I said, well, why are you together? And they say, oh, he's my everything. And I usually say, I certainly hope not.
But it is really true. You don't want to rain on the parade of young love on one hand, but on the other, when you realize that there is this kind of full omnicomprehensive dependency on each other, you see that there is a lack of maturity, there is a lack of growth, no?
And I think there's the love ends up being sort of thwarted if it doesn't become a channel towards something eternal.
Yeah, which is what Dante is trying to tell us, I think, and he's been trying to tell us since Canto 5 of Inferno, no, with Francesca. Maybe one of the topics that he talks about more often in Divine Comedy is love, in all his thousands of different manifestations, and always, even from the lowest level, when he's talking to Francesca, always with a very, let's say, respectful and self-conscious, in a gentle way. He's never right. He's always very understanding of the people who take love in the wrong way.
Well, he started off his career as a love poet, and that's, and so he's really wrapping his head around this. I gave my energies and my talents to trying to explain love, and perhaps it's not surprising that they would have chosen a love poet as the person to explain heaven. Because in the end, it's not just a place, it's about a relationship of love. And if you don't understand it in terms of love, you've gotten it all wrong. And so I think Dante's constantly purifying his own notion of love, but he sees something there that has some sort of dignity. It could have been turned around, it could have turned out right. You mentioned C.S. Lewis, and of course C.S. Lewis was a professor of Renaissance and medieval literature. He, taught Dante. Whenever I read with my seminarians The Great Divorce, which is one of my favorites of his, I'm always shocked by the number of little influences from the Divine Comedy that get into it. So no, he really is hugely influenced by Dante, and his three loves, his four loves are all there too. So I think C.S. Lewis always has Dante standing behind him. So I think there is something definitely about love, and that gets back to what we were saying at the beginning, that that bread of life, that bread of angels, that is the focus at the beginning, is really about entering into this relationship with God. You can't reduce it to a list of theories or a list of beliefs that you have. It's in fact a relationship.
Yeah, yeah. Now, maybe this is a difficult question because I haven't fully articulated it myself, but I'm thinking this. Is there a way to, when speaking to a non-Christian who loves the Divine Comedy, is there a way that is more appropriate than others to warm them up to the religious aspect of Paradiso? In other words, is it possible to say, hey, okay, this is your choice, your decision, and there is Christ's proposal, okay, Christ's proposal, but we are, there are centuries and centuries of Greek ancient geniuses and philosophers and all over the world who have always been saying and writing that the human being is this weird creature that's always been in between earth and the divine, in this meeting point between earthly matters and divine matters. And we are like that. It's not something that you can choose not to be. You just are like that. So would that be a direction for somebody who is not religious to maybe?
I think that,
yeah,
I think so. I always start with Inferno and Purgatorio because those you can understand from the point of view of human nature, morality, and how certain actions end up undermining our human nature and others support them. So you can come at that through a very rationalistic backgrounding. I think, and that's why Virgil is able to accompany Dante all the way up to the top of Mount Purgatory. But as soon as he gets there, he has to hand off, first to Matilda and then to Beatrice. He can't really go further.
yeah.
And so what do you do when you reach the outer limits of what reason
And
can talk about?
Reason.
Yeah,
yes.
That's right. So you come to a place where all those arguments stop working. And I think all that you can do is to point to an experience that these people have of desiring something more, of recognizing that all of this laid out in front of them might be true and might be good, but it isn't entirely fulfilling. And so I like to plant that hook in them that there's something more. You're made for something more. You're made for a bigger experience than anything this world has to offer.
Yeah.
And just to let that, and that's why this book's called Yearning, let that yearning for something more be what moves you.
Yeah, there's there is the objection of saying, well, I'm trying to understand how something can be true beyond the point where Virgil has to disappear. I think this is more or less what our age is telling us. There is a concept of accepted truth which struggles to understand that there can be truth and there is truth beyond rationality, beyond where our limited intellect can reach. And this is difficult. I'm not saying this is easy to manage or to express, but it makes the difference between struggling to understand where we are in this pool between the divine and the earthly, and finding that place where we fit perfectly. That's where we are meant to fit, and which is with Christ. Obviously, this is my take as a Christian. But I'm curious because this type of help, I would love it to be not only for religious people and for Christians, but for anybody. And I see so much insight that if somebody approaches your books thinking, I'm not religious, therefore I'm not going to read it, they're going to miss a lot, even for their own life, for their own experiences.
Well, as we were going back to this idea of that, starts with that, the bread there, that this is about a relationship. And you know, if you try to explain a relationship to somebody who's not in that relationship, sometimes it doesn't make any sense at all. We talk about sort of the foolishness or the craziness of love. And you know, you're trying to explain why you're marrying the person you're marrying. You're trying to explain why you're friends with this kook, you know? And people from the outside don't understand this inner dynamics. And it's sort of mysterious.
Even to you sometimes, yeah.
How many husbands have I said, you know, I've sat across from my wife at the breakfast table, and after 37 years, I still don't have a clue what she's thinking. And I said, but it's okay. You learn to live with this mystery. And every relationship that's interpersonal requires that living with a mystery. And so when you're getting into this place where you're talking about entering into a relationship with God, obviously this is going to be way more mysterious than those mysterious relationships we have with other human beings.
Yeah, that's why it has a lot to do with trust, because unfortunately, a lot of conversations among friends, inside families nowadays, crash against you know, let's resolve this religious problem with our rationality. Let's just dig and dig and dig and do the fine point. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's so limited, because it's like me explaining why I married my wife.
Exactly.
I'm unable to do that in words.
Yeah. I found that when I was trying to explain why I became a Catholic. You know, underneath faith, and the Catechism is very clear about, quoting my close friend St. Thomas Aquinas, and your namesake. They say that faith is an act of the intellect saying yes to the truth by command of the will, which was moved by God through grace. So the intellect isn't acting on its own anymore. It's not acting because it sees. It's acting because the will says, like the Blessed Virgin at Cana, listen to whatever he says, do whatever he tells you. And why does the will say that? Because the will has had a personal experience of God. In the end, it's because of that contact with God that our will turns to the intellect and says, believe.
You should trust. Yes.
Yeah. And this is why when St. Peter entrusts Dante with this mission of the Divine Comedy towards the end of Paradiso, he empowers him as a missionary of hope, not a missionary of truth, a missionary of hope. That there is something beyond that I can set my heart on. It might go beyond what I can think about, but I can set my heart on it and have some confidence about it.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly why Paradiso is the culmination of I mean, just thinking about the ambition of somebody who sits down and says, I'm going to take Christianity and put it into a magnificent poem that culminates with a vision of God that I'm not even going to try to get into. But this, and since you touched on your friend St. Thomas, so I know you're a Thomist in terms of your academic background.
Yes.
And between the lines of the Paradiso, there are these intransparents, this presence, these faces looming, and one is St. Thomas that is always there, and the other one is St. Augustine. There are many others, of course, but you know, their faces are always there, right, in transparency. And how do you teach that? How do you explain that? And do you think, like I do, that nobody like Dante has been able to give color to St. Thomas, where the Summa, which I am, by the way, I will try to read in the rest of this year. This is one of my projects for, you know, I'm a little scared already, but that may seem to be heavy and dry sometimes, Dante really breathed life into it, so that St. Thomas feels very close to us.
I think you see the humanity in him. You see the perception of humanity. And I think in the end, that's best expressed poetically and not theologically. You need real characters. You can't have abstractions if you're talking human nature.
So you're siding with Dante on this.
I am.
Yeah.
Well, see, but remember, people forget this. St. Thomas was one of the great poets of the 13th century. The O Salutaris, almost all the hymns and many of the prayers for Corpus Christi were written by St. Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was an amazing poet. O Sacrum Convivium, these, O Holy Banquet. These are those things that we sing on Holy Thursday as we're doing the procession to the altar of repose. Those are St. Thomas. And
yeah. No, please go ahead.
So I think he has that poetic insight. He knows his job as a teacher is to put this down as systematically as possible.
Right.
But I think his poetic soul sort of loses itself every once in a while and unleashes in his poetry. And in the end, I think that's why he didn't end up finishing the Summa.
See, this is something that always fascinated me about the character, the personality of St. Thomas, because I've read books about him, and they said that he was somebody who would very often cry in prayer for joy, not necessarily for sadness or desperation, but they describe him as a deeply emotional man. And he wrote something that it reads almost like a software coding of a computer program for how technical it is.
Yeah.
And so, there's a difference there. While on the other hand, Dante had the same type of intense emotionality about him, but he didn't, let's say, put his ego aside in his writings, like St. Thomas did, and put his entire ego in his writing. No? That's maybe a big difference.
Yeah, I think in that way, I think Dante is more like St. Paul and St. Augustine, who weren't afraid to leave themselves in the equation when they were presenting faith. And I think there's something powerful, and I've always found it powerful growing up as a Protestant and becoming a Catholic, about personal testimony. I love hearing conversion stories because I like to see how God works in particular ways. Knowing that God works and that providence works in general as a theory is one thing. Seeing it work in a person in front of you is something entirely different. That's so inspiring. Experiencing a miracle is different from knowing God can do miracles. And so I think that there's something something explosive about the power of St. Augustine, St. Paul, and about Dante.
Yeah. So I had prepared another question about the language that Dante uses in Paradiso versus Purgatorio and Inferno. One of the most emeritus professors, Italian professors of Dante, his name is Emilio Pasquini of University of Bologna. And he said that in Paradiso, Dante shows himself as a poet of a completely different, or a much more higher level than in Purgatorio and Inferno. Not only because he's grown in these years that he's been writing, he's grown in his dominio, the power of syntax, and in his style. And I tend to personally agree with this type of comment because on one hand, we have the purposely technical difference in the language from the more maybe vulgar and the use of words that he did in Inferno, where there are some words that are used in Inferno and are never used anymore by Dante in Purgatorio and Paradiso. A lot of Latin and Latinisms in Paradiso. So there is a program that Dante had about. But at the same time, I think as an amateur that I am, I think I can feel the growth of Dante as a poet and as a man from the moment that he is writing Canto 1 of Inferno to Canto 33 of Paradiso. Don't you agree, feel the
I
same?
would agree. And speaking with Anthony Eslin about this, he says that he thought that in Paradiso, you can hear the music of his language. And he said he felt impelled to try to translate in Terza Rima because he just couldn't, it was just so much a part of the message now. And it's almost like you have to break into song.
Yes.
And whereas you're dealing with a narrative. Yeah, that's the edition that I use in the commentary, and it's what I use in class.
I got this book because of you and your comments, and it's a really beautiful translation.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too. And so I think there is something very musical, and you also see him losing himself every once in a while. He just can't find words. All these, and this will in use and in hymns, and he about the sort of interpenetration of things, that we'll be so connected that we're not just like next to each other, companions anymore, but we'll almost merge. And the union we were looking for here on Earth exceeds any sort of union we could even put into words now. And so he has to create language for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's already so difficult to think about somebody who, like Dante, who was trying to put words into something that he himself said is ineffable. Yeah. So he said it's ineffable, but I'm going to use words to actually say it.
Yes.
But then for somebody to actually translate it into another language, there must be, I can sometimes feel the headache myself when I read the English translations.
Yeah.
Because, and this is why when teaching it, it's always useful to have the Italian, the original on at least there, for people to see it, to get some inspiration from it.
Yes, I think that's true. I would like being able to look at it and see what the translators had to struggle with, because you're always trying to be precise, but you're also trying, especially in Paradiso, to keep the music. In Paradise, unlike Inferno, where there's no singing, Paradiso is a place where they're singing, except where Dante can't handle it anymore, and they turn it off for a while because it would overwhelm him. And
yeah, he knows that he knew that music is much more direct in terms of accessing the spiritual and just the divine, let's say. And in one way or the other, you can feel his own struggle, Dante's own struggle with words. But this emotion must have been real because it comes through from the pages from the cantos.
It does.
We can feel his pain in trying to express something that he knows is not properly expressible with words. Only a beautiful music maybe would be able to express. And so it's, that's the beauty of it, which brings us back to the importance of Paradiso in this triptych, and how people overall are still and probably will continue to be a little bit less attracted and enthusiastic about this cantica. We have to admit it. Because of how it is. There are some famous literary or writers like Umberto Eco in Italy. He kept saying that Paradiso, in his opinion, was absolutely the best of the three cantiche, and there are many other people who say that. At the end of the day, it's also a subjective taste, probably. I'm in love with Purgatorio, and I've always kind of convinced myself that Purgatorio is my favorite one, but there's nothing to do. The more I understand Paradiso, the more I'm inching towards Paradiso as probably my favorite now.
Yeah. I think Purgatorio is sort of where I am, but you know,
Where we are.
it's where we are. We're fighting our way through. We're dealing with imperfections. And this is why I found the beginning of Paradiso so encouraging, because at the beginning, in the first rings, all the rings that are under the influence of the shadow of the earth,
oh yes,
you have all of these people who are living with some sort of imperfection. People who left their convents and went off. People who didn't give God his due because they were so caught up with governing or so caught up with other things. And you see sort of caught up with their romantic love, that they didn't make God the absolute center. And you say, well, yeah, how many people make God the absolute center? Well, not very many, but it's interesting to see these people being there. And Dante's discussions with them and saying, aren't you worried that you're the lowest person in heaven? That you're at the lowest ring of heaven? Don't you want to be higher? And they said, yeah, I'm exactly filled here. This is what I could be. And I have to be, I'm satisfied with this. It is 100% fulfilling. And I couldn't be higher without stopping being me.
Yeah, yeah. Which, like you say very well, helps the readers hope. Because most of us, probably 99% of us, religious or not, deep down, we don't think we're worth it. We don't think we are worth of all that beauty of going to heaven, basically. And to see Picarda, to see Charles Martel, to see these characters as blessed souls, certainly gives us a little hope.
Picarda in particular, she's one of my favorites. Yeah. She's one of my favorites. But you know, it's also interesting to have people like Beatrice. What was Beatrice? She was just some young girl. She didn't do anything. And actually, I have her right here. She's sitting here behind me.
Oh, is that Beatrice? Oh,
that's Omi. I'll grab her. She sits with me regularly, and somebody gave her to me. So, yeah.
That is really lovely,
isn't it?
Is it coming from Italy, or is it something that is coming from?
I have no idea. It's entirely unsigned. So it says
very light, very nice.
It says Beatrice on the front, though. That's all I know. So she sits with me while I write. But who is she? But she's right up there in the top tier. And I think this sort of inside-out version of where people belong. The great theologians, people like St. Thomas Aquinas, they're in the realm of the sun, which is not the highest. So you end up with an inverted view of what was going to be powerful. St. Peter isn't running heaven.
Yeah. And we talked a lot about that moment when Virgil disappears, which many people know when it comes to the Divine Comedy and understand. But another moment that is maybe less popular and less understood is when Beatrice passes the baton to. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. All of a sudden, I mean, Dante has been looking less and less at Beatrice, and because she keeps saying, you know, there's another here. You could look through me to him, but in the end, you have to put your focus on him. And as he's doing this more and more, he recognizes that she's gone, and she hasn't really even said goodbye. There's not a heartbreaking goodbye like there was. The parting words with Virgil are just heartbreaking, I think.
So moving.
So moving. You know, I crown thee, you know, Lord of thyself, and I just but he just looks up and sees Beatrice now in her rightful place,
in her seat,
and he right in her throne, and he doesn't feel abandoned by that. He's now put things in the right place, and so he doesn't feel separated from her at all. And I think that as a result, there's something very different about it. There's a spiritual maturity that's there now, that I think allows him to feel the connection of God and the saints without having to have them visibly at his side all the time.
Someone said that those last few cantos, in those last few cantos, Dante really wanted to try and express Christian mysticism. as opposed to the understanding of Christianity through faith and theology that kind of Beatrice incarnates in the poem. What do you think about that? Would you agree? Or
well, there's so many times there, for example, when you sort of see the rose and it sort of goes inside out on you and you're not quite sure which way to look at the universe. Is this the center? Is this the outside? It turns out it's the center and everything else goes out from it. And I think he's constantly playing with your imagination there, and you just get a picture of it and you think you're in a particular place. You think you're on the outside of this big sphere looking down on Earth at the center, and you realize that the whole thing is inverted and that you've been looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. And so that idea that somehow things aren't as they appear is very important to Dante. And he begins with this almost lost experience. And for me, that's a very important part of the ending of all this. When I wrote my master's paper on this, it was on the word smarrire, to be lost. And it comes up right at the beginning when he's lost in the dark wood. But it comes up here in the last canto, when now he's lost in God's presence. And so that there really isn't an explanation for this now. It's just an experience. It's just an experience. And that experience is what he's going to take back with him, that's going to allow him to become this missionary of hope. It's not a new nugget of information. Because if faith isn't about that information, it's about that, it starts with that experience.
Yes. Which actually, I'm very happy that you concluded this way, because it goes straight back to what we were saying in the beginning, which is, if we focus on the meanders of rationality, we're never going to convince anybody of the deep, profound joy of Christianity. It is an experience. It's something that words in themselves will always struggle to communicate, and nobody but Dante could express it so well. That's the beauty of it. It's I mean, I would love to continue for hours and hours talking with you about the Divine Comedy, but my simple recommendation to anybody who's watching this is, do consider the spiritual value of Divine Comedy, and to take a leap of faith, let's say, and consider Father Paul's approach to Divine Comedy, which is probably something that I feel more readers and more scholars of the Divine Comedy should take, because this is what would have made Dante happy. I know that when I hear very intelligent scholars talk about Dante and say, you know, it's beautiful because it talks about love, full stop. There is something missing there. There is something missing that Dante would be partially happy about. So a huge thank you, Father Paul, once again. And
you're very welcome.
It's a great pleasure to chat with you as always. Thank you for writing these books, by the way.
It was a pleasure to teach. It was a pleasure to write. It was a pleasure to talk to you.